where we talked about basically the whole religion comes out of a shepherd tribe or multiple shepherd tribes. And the challenge of the religion, the story of the Torah is really, in a way, how can you keep shepherd religion and values when you become farmers and a nation? Because shepherds are nationless. They just have peoplehood. So the whole challenge is not to lose your soul when you become a civilization. And you can see that reflected in today's Torah portion, of course, because we talked about it a little bit in class, which is that you can view today's Torah portion just in terms of symbolism or moral lessons, but it's a very dangerous thing to turn Bible stories into moral lessons, because they don't necessarily, not only are the Bible characters not really moral paragons of any, but that's not what the Bible sees itself as doing. It sees itself as recording the relationship of the people and God through time. It's really God's story. It's a story of the relationship of God and the Jewish people through time. And that, so it's not stories this is not the tortoise and the hare. That's called allegory. Allegory is when you say, it's not really tortoise, and it's not really a hare. Tortoise are people that move slowly, and hares are people that rush. And so do you get it now? And yet we do that in Sunday school, because how else do you teach complex ancient Near Eastern literature to kids is to be like, Cain wasn't mindful of his brother. And Abel, I guess, was. But that's not really what the story is about. And the story is more likely about the fact that Cain is a farmer and Abel's a shepherd. We're clearly a shepherd people. And we're horrified by the development of agricultural civilization in what was, in today's Torah portion, the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. And so we see a contrast between shepherd values and ways of being. And yet, there's a consciousness that we do want to have our own nation. Some of that consciousness comes later than the patriarchs, but they're already having a sense of a future where we have our own land and our own ability to self-govern, and how will we do that in a way that doesn't turn us into the idolaters that other nations have become when they've had a chance to do the same thing. And so it did relate a little bit to today, and tending to your soul, and the contrast between Abel and Cain, and what is the idea of the shepherd, so you can see even in a Moroccan and Italian rabbis of the Middle Ages and late Middle Ages, early modern period, there's still this concern about what does it mean a shepherd is someone who has time to do reason, time to think, time to plan, and does pay attention to who's watching whom. They're basically watching other human beings and trying to make sure the shepherd people get along. And Cain is, when you think of it, the punishment is to be a farmer. You're going to get expelled from the Garden of Eden, and you're going to have to dig out. You're not going to have time or to watch your fellow and these other kinds of things. So it's a mixture of morality and ethics, and it's a mixture of a lot of things. So the Torah is basically a set of our tribal memories. So these are the tribal stories to convey to you that you're part of a people. You are part of a people that's thousands and thousands of years old, and their stories are important. We can't necessarily remember every single one, and that's like the human mind. So the human mind doesn't remember every single story. Go ahead.
Might be a little hard for some people to hear.
Oh, is it hard to hear? I can turn it up, actually. I'm actually on microphone.
I'll get up front.
No, but I can actually turn it up a little. Well, I just don't want to make everyone else crazy. Is it too loud already? You can be honest. It's too loud already. So, that's okay? Okay, I'll talk loud. But it is connected to the system. I mean, if that helps at all. Okay, so
That's why I moved here.
good. You're doing the right thing. And I can stand up. I mean,
I can go back and speak it for you. It's one of it's on the sound.
No, but then it might be too loud. I'm worried it's going to be too loud if I turn it up. I think it might be. I could tweak it a little bit. Would it help if I turned it up? Probably not. Okay, so I'll just talk loud. So
Is there a way to make it only play
that I don't know, and I have to, if maybe Jerry knows, but it's a new system, so it's a little complicated. So
It sounded that loud when I was sitting in the library.
it did?
No, it
Didn't? I mean, so, well, anyway, that's, okay. But we have to move on to today's topic, which is prayer. Let me grab my prayer book. Okay, I'll keep this close by. And if you have an Eitz Chaim, which is one of these. If you have the Pentateuch, it may be under the seat in front of you. Get it out, and if not, I'll hold it up from here. Turn to the back of the book. To page 1520 and 1521.
Can you say the page number again?
1520. It's pictures. Caught it, so I don't have to fast. No, I don't have to fast for a book. But let's do that. 1520. Okay, 1520 and 1521. So there are 5 books in the Torah. The first book is Genesis. We just started it today. And it is the story of our shepherd ancestors between around 1400 and 1750 BCE. It starts with the creation of the world, but it very quickly gets to Abraham, and we'll talk about that when we get to Bible. And so our tribal ancestors living in what is today Israel, in the land of Canaan. As I said on Yom Kippur, the idea that we're not indigenous to the land is pretty silly. We've been in the land for almost 4,000 years. In any case, so we're there. According to the Torah, all of our people are enslaved in Egypt at one point around, let's say, 1300 BCE. Historically, it's probably part of our people were enslaved in Egypt, and the rest of them were still in Canaan. And there's an exodus around 1250 BCE of the ones who get out of Egypt after some form of oppression or enslavement of what translates as something like chain gangs, like being put to work in national building projects. And they get to the land around 1250 or 1200, 1175, whenever, and they rejoin with the other tribes who are still there from before. So we have Genesis about our shepherd folks in Canaan, now Israel. Then Exodus, we're enslaved and we get out. The second half of Exodus is about, okay, the way you're going to be different when someday you have your own nation. So we're on our way to getting our own nation back in Canaan, but you need to build a Mishkan. Mishkan just means a place of presence, a place of God's presence. And having this thing in your midst, having a temple altar site in your midst, can change everything. So one of the tribes will just be called the Levites, and the Levites will be in charge of religion. And they will be in charge of running this thing. And if this thing is in your midst and you're good to it and you listen to the Levites, you have the potential of saving your soul as a nation and as a people. The Levites are the teachers. They are the medical personnel. They're also the altar song leaders. Eventually they get instruments. And they're also the local police. Today I call them public servants. Because I think almost everything biblical has a modern counterpart. I don't think people have changed that much. If I could, I would line up, 100 people up and say, that's how many generations it goes back to this time or less. Like it's not like ancient times where we always think time is faster than it is. Have you ever read a sci-fi novel from 30 years ago? And they're like, in 30 years, we'll be flying to Mars on our space cars. And then you're like, actually, it's really not that different except for cell phones. And so going back 3,000 years, they weren't so different than we are today. We think, oh my God, they practically couldn't even talk to them. They probably didn't know anything. They're like cavemen or something. I was like, not really. So the idea was, so public servants, police, teachers, with national health care nurses and doctors, which they were, the people who are the helpers. They are not allowed to own land, and they run this. What happens here? Okay, it's not really prayer. It's called bringing offerings. And you're required to bring different kinds of offerings. Some of those offerings are sacrificed to God, a very small percentage of them. In other words, there's a big barbecue, there's an altar kind of thing. Well, there's actually not a barbecue here. They're killed at the altar. There is a barbecue in the middle of this thing out front. But you bring your animal, and it is divided up. Some animals are provided on behalf of the community and are burned up entirely, but the vast majority of the offerings, the blood is returned to God by being put on the altar and sizzling, and most, except for some of the entrails, most of the pieces are divided up and shared. So they're either shared to the Levites because they have no land and no other jobs and you have to feed them, or they're divided up among the poor, or they're just divided up for you to take home. You can to share. So it is a way of you have to go, you have to share what you have to the extent that you can. You don't have to bring animals if you can't. You'll see over here, there's also something that we have in the kitchen, in the refrigerators, which you find in every restaurant, walk in. You have a stack of trays that you put bread on, unleavened and leavened. So you could also donate bread, or you could just donate some grain, whatever it is that you had. So there's a redistribution of wealth. There is a checking in with people to see whether they're sick or not, they're not sick. There's a system for comforting the bereaved that happens there as well. And then the idea is that in the tent, there is not an altar, there is a box, an ark, in which there is the remains of the Ten Commandments. And above the ark, Moses likes to go in there and commune and receive messages from God, and that is among you. So between the connection to God and the Levites and the sharing, it basically creates a permanent shepherd home, which is kind of like the tents are around, and where it used to be in Abraham's individual tent would be a big tent, and he would invite in the whole tribe because he was the richest one, and he would kill a couple of animals, and everyone would be fed. Now we do it as a community. So we preserve the shepherd spirituality through hospitality, sharing in a centralized location. And the ark is there as well. The synagogue today is an heir to that. So like people always seem shocked when people say, well, I don't like synagogues and I don't join them. I like summer camps, Jewish summer camps, or I like a JCC, or I like a Jewish day school. And I think all those are great. And I'm like, yeah, but they're not the temple. Without synagogues, Judaism dies, right? It is the temple in our time. And people look at me like I'm crazy. They've never thought of that. They're like, oh, I don't know if it's the temple in Jerusalem. And I'm like, okay, look at the picture, right? Now, it's not cloth walls, it's regular walls. Okay, we don't have an altar for killing, although we just did some communal sharing in the back. So here we don't have it, but there would have, in the tent, and it was a menorah, and in many synagogues, they'll have a giant menorah sitting right here or right there, okay? It is the candelabrum. It was like, if you think of God as like Liberace, I used to live in Vegas. It's like the giant candelabrum by the piano, right? I used to live really close to the Liberace Museum. So you have the candelabrum for light. The fire keeps going. And come on in. And this is the tent, the Holy of Holies. So we have an ark now. Instead of the Ten Commandments, it has the Torah. But when you think about it, that's a pretty continuous thing, that we have words, we don't have a statue. Actually, once the Ten Commandments got moved to save it from invaders, the ark was empty. The ark was empty, which was also kind of very deep. We have famous stories told at places like the Museum of the Diaspora in Israel, which is when the Romans conquered, they were told, as they did when they conquered places, to bring back the gods, and so that the gods could be enslaved by the Roman gods. And so when they sacked the ark, there was nothing inside. And they were like, where are the gods? And it's like, no, it's empty. God's invisible, right? And they're like, I have no idea what you mean by that. I have no idea. It's empty. There's nothing there. And they're like, that's the true God, the nothingness, the invisibility, the everywhere. And so they grabbed the menorah. And so the famous relief of the Archer Titus, the triumph of the Roman Empire, they have a picture of the Roman army carrying the menorah to show that they had actually conquered the Jewish people.
So we still do sacrifices, we just pay dues instead
Correct.
of bringing in chicken.
Correct. So back then, you could bring silver and gold, but mostly and copper, but mostly you brought produce and things like that. And today we do. There was multiple tithes. A lot of them went to the poor because it was basically forming this redistribution of wealth. You had to pay a 10% tithe on everything, which you brought in the form of if you grew pomegranates, you brought pomegranates. If you grew wheat, you brought wheat, or barley, you brought barley. Although the Torah also says, or if it's heavy to carry, you can sell it locally wherever you live, turn it into money, and then take that to Jerusalem and bring the money. Then there's a second 10% tithe for other redistribution, and then every few years there's a third 10% tithe that goes to the poor. And so you have multiple tithes that are taking place for the redistribution. One of the things I pointed out, and this is, I have to get back to prayer because I know I'm talking too much, which I always do, is that I gave a sermon a long time ago, and for some reason, I think it became popular in my podcast. It must have been linked to by someone, because no one else knows about my podcast. And it was basically, it was on the idea that you think that you don't like going to synagogue. No one's ever liked going to synagogue, right? That was basically it. The idea being like, people tell me, well, going to synagogue's not my thing. Going to the temple wasn't people's thing. It wasn't like Dina woke up in the morning and said, I can't wait to go to that smelly place with lines of animals getting killed. Will you take me today, right? There's no sense that the temple was like a joyous place to be. It was obligatory to go. It would be like voting's not my thing. Well, that's really nice, and you're going to cause disaster upon all of us if you don't vote. Speaking of which. Exactly. So, like, the idea was that you are required to make community, and there are times when you are required to go. It never says, like, because it is so much fun. It does say it's so much fun, things that are otherwise. It does say you will have a blast when you go to the temple for Shavuot with your family and friends, and you party the whole time. The trip to the temple is just kind of like, it's like, I don't know, going to Disney and waiting in line. The waiting in line is not the fun part, right? It's when you get on the ride. So the idea that somehow this was always like, it was super fun. It was only fun basically on Sukkot and Shavuot and Passover. And that's because it was family vacation. So in ancient Israel, Sukkot was winter vacation. Pesach was a week off for spring vacation, and then Shavuot was an additional short vacation. And it said, it's not a good thing to say because of AA, which I'm very much connected with, but it says in the Torah, it's like, take your stuff, you can turn it into money if it's too heavy to carry, and take the time off and spend it both with your offering, and take what's left and spend it on wine and other intoxicants. And enjoy and be happy. That was the fun part. It was the vacation part of it. It wasn't necessarily the trip to the temple. Not that the temple was such a terrible show, but it wasn't the greatest show on earth. So today, this is the way you make community. So it's not supposed to be like the funnest thing in the world to pray. Prayer is centered on the idea of making community, and now we're at prayer. The basic idea being that you are, after the time of the temple, when there are no more animals, you have synagogues, you have enlightenment coming from the ark in the form of the spirituality of reading, and then what do you do here? You connect with community, which is not always fun, but it is humanizing, and it's the right thing to do. Otherwise, you end up in your own little cocoon. And why do we pray? We pray alone, but we do it together. So Jewish prayer is kind of weird because everyone's kind of like Chris is over there doing her thing, and Dan's doing his thing, and Dina got here at the beginning, so she's all caught up, and other people are behind. And you're kind of coming together to pray alone. But it's considered much better to do that together than to just do it at your home. You are allowed to pray at home, and daily prayer is a great spiritual practice. But ideally, you make a minyan, you make a prayer quorum with others, where a lot of it is like you're doing your own thing. So it's very, as my wife is converted, she's like, look, in church, they're like, follow the bouncing ball, right? Everyone should be on the bouncing ball. Here, that would be like 100 balls thrown around. Everyone seems to be on a different page. Everyone's on a different key for sure. And it's like, so you're like, well, it's really, Germans in the 1800s German Jews were very embarrassed in front of their Lutheran friends because they thought things sounded terrible. They thought we needed a proper choir and a proper organist to keep everyone together, but that's not Jewish prayer. You're doing your own thing, but you're doing it together. There's also personal prayer. So I just wanted you to see here that this is the tent, and we communally eat together as well, and it's the area in which we make community and interact. Okay.
Do you know how and when incense no longer was part of what we use?
That's a really good question. I should know the answer to that when incense went away. I know the Greek and Russian Orthodox Church still have it, so that was the. Yeah, and so I don't know. So why was there incense? The idea seems to be to cover up the smell. So if you were at my Kol Nidre sermon, where I talked about this a little bit, I said, people will say, you Hebrews smell like animals, and it kind of did. You know what I mean? There had a lot of animals. We were the shepherd people, the flock people. So I don't know exactly when it went away, but I also do know that I listened to a report on the news this week that they'd found a seed from 2,000 years ago. Did you hear this too? It was on NPR. And they didn't know what it was. And they have the technology now to grow an ancient seed that's practically fossilized. And it turned out to be an herb, but then they couldn't figure out what it was. And they had to send it out to all these scientists all over the world to kind of brainstorm it or whatever group figure it out. And then one guy figured it out that it was a species of the frankincense and myrrh families. And so, which was the main spices, frankincense and myrrh, that were used in the temple along with the other mixtures. Okay. So now prayer. What is the struggle? So let's say a couple of things about prayer that are just random. Whatever hits you, great. Produce small amounts of the hormone that makes, or the neurotransmitter that makes you feel connected to others. Some of the things about using words to pray that the rabbis have talked about over the years is that in rabbinic tradition, meaning post-sacrifice, the tradition continues basically with what we call rabbinic Judaism, that although we think of Jewish laws or Jewish practices as being kosher, keeping Shabbat, keeping holidays, and praying in synagogue, for the rabbis, they basically see that the largest set of laws that everyone is ignoring, which incidentally is the main thing in the list that we do on Yom Kippur. It's almost all laws of speech. So they basically say your inner spirit is reflected in what comes out of your mouth. And people think they can control what comes out of their mouth, but they don't. We're all incredibly transparent, right? So I think I'm so noble and good, and then someone can go home and be like, he gossiped about that person, he complained about this, blah, blah, blah. We all think we're so hard to figure out, and we're not. So that your inner spirit is reflected in what comes out. And so prayer is connected to that in multiple ways. For one thing, if you have a liturgy, why am I doing a liturgy at all? Why have these practices? Well, one reason is, what if you could kind of train your brain with good words? And a lot of those words are good values. They're things about love and compassion and care. A lot of them are about Israel, which is one of the reasons that if you're going to be an anti-Zionist Jew, you're with the wrong rabbi. A lot of the prayers they're really about understanding, about thinking about Israel regardless of where you live in the world. So it's what's happening in Israel? What is it like there? What are my people thinking? They're about enlightenment. So all the themes of the prayers, I could say a lot of them, they're you're practicing those words. The words you take in are likely to shape the words that come out in your life. When I read in English today, the prayer for the community, right? May you speak words of Torah. May the words of Torah be ever on your children's tongues. If I go home and say, I never thought of this thing I shared today about Adam naming himself and naming, or herself, themselves, and naming God, that becomes the conversation that my kids hear. Or I can come home and say, What happened on Married at First Sight? If you know that show, it's very popular among my kids. So if people get married after 5 minutes, it never ends well. Never ends well at all. And they do it in every country. So like they're just cursing me. It's like the 10 plagues. So like what words occupy you will change you and what comes out. What else about words? So both the content of the prayers, another way to think of it, and this is a little different, I'm throwing out all kinds of different things about prayer. It's like survey course, is that if what you're trying to do in prayer is to change, I think Heschel said this, I'm sure Heschel said this somewhere. The point of prayer is not to change you while you're praying. The point of prayer is to change you when you're not praying. It's to change you for afterward. That's the point of it. So another thing could be praying is a mantra, right? So for you, let's say you're starting out and you're like, I don't know these prayers. It's hard enough for me to learn the candle lighting prayer. Well, if you grow up, first of all, the reason my kids, like Marav knew the Friday night service, like she never got taught the Friday night service in tutoring, and then Meg said she can't do Friday night at her bat mitzvah because she says you've never taught it to her. So I was like, okay, well, let's give her a book and tell her to do it. So she made one mistake because she came to services. You learn them as songs. I know those of you who are older, like it's hard because you're not kids anymore and your brain's not as plastic. That's going to be a curse for the rest of your life. But the idea is you come enough, fish, you don't have to be able to read Hebrew. And then you'll get self-conscious. You'll be like, I'm sure I'm making mistakes. I'm making so many mistakes. So let me listen to you. You made 2 mistakes. Yeah, I told you. 2 mistakes on a whole page. Oy. And she like feels terrible about it. I shouldn't go. Someone's going to notice. All of that's in your head, right? That's pretty amazing for someone who's barely studied any Hebrew to like just know it because they hear it over and over again. So in a way, they're mantras. In a way, to get if a lot of religion is about, you can never get rid of the ego. The ego will always come back. Anyone who said they got rid of their ego, it's the ego talking, right? It is. You got to think of the ego, which is a real thing. You're like, we are messed up as humans. You got to treat the ego as like a dog that's always barking at you, like, ruff, 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 like, let me take over, like, pay attention to me, do what I want to do. Don't go do your homework. Don't read that book. Don't write a poem. Pay attention to me. Play with me, play with me, play with me. The only thing you can do with the ego is you got to learn to get some bones. And you got to get a really strong arm to throw the bone as far as you can, and then you get a few little bits of time to be without the ego until it comes back. Prayer is like that. I'm going to be here. Ego is like, check your phone, turn on the TV, think about what you're going to do tomorrow, think about what you told your kids yesterday that you feel ashamed of, blah, 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 right? So it's like, nope, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to be, Aleinu l'shabeach ladon, and so like your brain does a mantra and part of your brain gets taken away over here. And that frees up another part of your brain to have words and thoughts. You're making a space for something to happen in your brain besides the usual. So one is, it could be you actually do want to train it with other words. One is a form of mantric meditation where you know these things by heart. If you think we Jews, or if you think we can daven, we can pray that fast and be like, oh yeah, and bless your Lord, and you do miracles every day, morning, afternoon, and night. I can think of all of those, and I followed those signs, and I did that, and I'm really super grateful. And besides, compassion and love and care and goodness and the light of Israel and shalom. And if you think I have meaning in all of that, you're nuts, right? It's mantric. It's like, now, if I'm lucky, I'm like, blah, 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 and may it be enlightenment for the eyes. Enlightenment for the eyes. Okay, and meanwhile, while my brain is doing the rest of the prayers, I'm just thinking about enlightenment of the eyes, or something I saw on the other page, or something that came up. So prayer is somewhat doing that. Another thing about prayer. We do it in the ancient language because we preserve the tradition. So one of the things that we do to create peoplehood is that I know I'm basically doing more or less the same prayers that we've been doing for thousands of years. Some of the prayers have changed and been added, There's accretion in it. Things have accreted to the prayer service and to the prayers. Some things have been added. But, for those of us who get older and things like that, we think a lot about what connects us to our ancestors and how will my children, my children's children, and all the generations I'll never know, how are they connected to me? The idea that they could be doing the same prayers and they're going to read the same book and they're going to call me in the middle of the afternoon. Oh, it's Rabbi Winston. Hope everything's okay. The fact that they're going to be thinking about Adam and Eve and these stories and maybe even reading the Rashi on it and the commentaries that I did, that's incredibly comforting. That's what makes us a people. So that part of it is that you preserve the language and it has those kinds of forms. So I wanted to say, these are some of the things that are why we do it together. Now, can I pray alone? Yeah. Should have a morning. I prefer an evening prayer practice. Most people prefer a morning prayer practice. And you can certainly pray alone. So now I'm going to talk about the service. The service essentially has a couple of big pieces, the formal liturgy of every service. And the two big prayers you do are the Shema and the Amidah. There are a lot more prayers, but the biggies are Shema Yisrael, Adonai, Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. There's one God. Okay? Or the God is singular, or God is unique, or God is something unto God's self that's different from everything else, however you translate it. The Amidah means standing, and originally it was completely silent, and it still preserves a silence. Some scholars, I don't see why they would be wrong, consider it to have originated in meditation. So in the Second Temple period, which is a really fancy term that means that last couple of generations before the temple was destroyed, we know that we're basically following other Near Eastern practices. There was a little bit of a schism in terms of what people were doing, and some were pursuing meditation, ecstasy, and visions. And some were more no, we should be doing stuff in the temple that's communal, like handing over your animal. Maybe instead we sing a song. Those are two very, very different things. I'm going to pray to the point where I get to ecstatic enlightenment, and the other one. So one of the traditions is that the Amidah, the standing silent prayer now, was originally an accommodation to make a space within the service for those who want to meditate. And then the accommodation is, once that happens, there's a liturgy that was produced for it fairly early that's repeated out loud. So we still do that in the morning service today. So the Amidah is your private time in front of God. So the main idea of it is you're supposed to face the ark or face east if you're alone, and you're supposed to think, before whom am I standing? It's the main idea. Before whom am I standing? What is the relationship I have to the universe? How am I a part of the universe? How is the universe part of me? And to kind of have the intimacy of that. Prayer is going to be different for different people. You know how some people say, I don't know if your color red is the same as my color red. How would I ever know? Prayer is like that. I have no idea what prayer is for anybody else. I don't know what it's, I have friends who does synesthesia or whatever. He says, he gets colors when he hears people singing. I don't even know what that would be like. So I don't know what prayer is supposed to be for any of you. All I know is what it is for me. But it's that silent time and that prayer. So that gives you these two anchors. The Shema in the morning and at night doesn't happen in the afternoon. The Amidah happens 3 times. The Amidah prayers vary between Shabbat and weekday. So during the weekday, you have 19 blessings that you're supposed to do, or just let your mind go astray. You're allowed to just pray on your own. You're allowed to make your own prayer. Those 19 blessings cover different things. People you're praying for healing, prayers you have for Israel, prayers you have for peace. They're all very noble sentiments. On Shabbat and holidays, it's abbreviated because, and this goes back to what Larry said, during the week, you're allowed to petition God, and during Shabbat and holidays, you are not allowed to petition God. So on Shabbat, you can't ask for things, and when we do Shabbat in the class, we'll see that Shabbat is supposed to be the idea that you're living in the Garden of Eden. You don't need to be yeah, but what's on the outside of the Garden of Eden? Can I get I heard they have oranges in Florida, and we just have pomegranates. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbat. Shabbat, you're going to be oh man, check out the pomegranates. So on Shabbat, you can't think of what you need or that you lack. You're not supposed to think, I need to modify the world needs to be different. You're supposed to try to experience the world as a blessing until Shabbat ends. So your prayers are basically oriented around, there are signs all around me, morning, noon, and night, that point me in the way of holiness. You can pray for let peace descend, because there's already peace. The peace on high should come to all of us. We pray recognizing holiness, recognizing the gifts of our ancestors. They're really all gratitude prayers on Shabbat and holidays. Then during the week, you can pray for but my dog is sick, or I really hope I get a good result on my taxes and a good refund. Go ahead. So great question, which is, we do pray for those who are sick on Shabbat, and I go around and ask for names. My understanding of that is that there are a couple of examples in Judaism where the rabbis were trumped by the demands of ordinary Jewish folk, so that we should not be doing a mishaberach on Shabbat. We shouldn't be asking for healing on Shabbat and on holidays. We still don't do it on high holy days. We don't add into the service. And it was really just people demanded. And I can understand that, because I work for you all, right? And if you said, we really like you, Nadav, but we're firing you if you're too good to pray for the sick on Shabbat, I'll be like, let's pray for the sick on Shabbat.
You delete that blessing from the Amidah.
Right.
There is that blessing in the Amidah.
Correct. Because in the Amidah, 3 times a day, you're praying for the people you're praying for who are sick. And if you do it communally, you're praying for it communally. And you delete that on Shabbat and holidays. So people made... put it back in. And there's a line in there, Shabbat hili mizok, which means you don't cry out to God on Shabbos. It means I shouldn't be saying this. So basically, you're saying during the Mishaberach prayer for the sick on Shabbat and on holidays, if you do it, you're supposed to say, but we're not supposed to, and we all know that. There are other times where the folk have trumped the rabbis. One example was the night before last. The Torah does not come out at night. Even on Yom Kippur, it only comes out before sunset, which is why we time Kol Nidre to be 10 minutes. The Torah only comes out at the very beginning of the service. It has to be before sunset. You put it back in and close the ark. But on Simchat Torah, we take out the scrolls and we paraded them the night before last. And that is also a very late development, post-rabbinic, post-Talmudic. People said, it'd be so much fun to dance with the Torahs. We just rewound the Torah. Let's dance with them at night. So then people show up. Do I wear a talit? Do I not wear a talit? We're not supposed to be doing this anyway, so do what you want. I talked to Meg. She's like, well, do we do 2 chapters or a chapter and a half at the end of Deuteronomy? I'm like, it doesn't matter. We're not supposed to be doing it in the first place. Tomorrow morning, you finish Deuteronomy and you start Genesis. But tonight, So the service is, so there are times in Judaism where the people made demands on the rabbis and they accommodated them, which shows how good a question it was. So you are allowed to ask for things in your prayers during the week. It's very nice for me during the week to take time to have something that interrupts the flow of the ego and the flow of anxiety, and just to have morning prayers. If you do them yourself, I don't know, what do you think, Jerry, 25 minutes?
Yeah.
About 25 minutes. Afternoon prayer, I love praying mincha. If you do it alone, 7 minutes. Evening prayer, if you do it alone, 6 minutes. About the same, 6 or 7. Doesn't take much time. Rabbis, so Judaism is full of arguments. So quiz question. Raise your hand if you think we are obligated to pray twice a day. Raise your hand if you think we're obligated to pray 3 times a day. So anyone who's read the Talmud and Masechet Brachot, the tractate on praying, the answer is it's both. They can't agree. So they derive from our tradition. The rabbis say, definitely there was a morning offering, there was an afternoon offering, but there was no evening offering in the temple. So you're really only obligated for the first 2, but there was a thing in the evening, so maybe we have to do 3. We're not really sure. So if you do 2, you're kosher. You do 3, that's better, maybe. And then, but the evening prayers are very short. And they incorporate things that were originally done by your bedside. The key prayer there is the Shema, which derives from the bedtime Shema, meaning say Shema before you go to bed. It's just like Little House on the Prairie. Kids, say your prayers before you go to bed. And then, as Laura Ingalls is tucked in by her paw, and she says, Pa, I'm also praying that, our dog gets better from being sick. And Paul says, that's really sweet. And we're supposed to do the same thing. It's called the Hashkivenu. So it's the key part of the evening prayer is to say, may a sukkah of peace cover us or cover me and those I care about, and so nothing bad happens during the night. We all wake up healthy and happy, ready for life. And so that got incorporated into the evening service, and it's that and the Amidah, basically, and you're done. So,
Without the repetition.
right, because there's no repetition. It's only silent Amidah at night. You don't do any of it out loud because we're pretty sure you're not supposed to be saying it at all. So we're not sure. So that gives you some of the structure. Now let's look at the structure of the service. And that you've probably read because I talk about it a lot, and it's already in the handout that you can take home. There's a basket of them. But this is where I really think it gets interesting, which is that every service has 2 parts, and some services have 3. And those 2 parts are the whole early part of the service is prayers that connect to nature. It is connecting to God through nature, and it never gets old. I pray it every day, and it has never gotten old. So anyone who says to me, Rabbi, I would come to synagogue, but it's just not the thing I find fun. I already made fun of that. And also, I don't find God in synagogue. I find God in nature. That's what the prayers are saying, right? So they're saying, it would be weird if you didn't. If your attitude is, oh my God, nature's so awful. I hate the Grand Canyon. I hate the birds. They're really, really awful. Thank God we're inside with heating and fluorescent lighting. I'd be like, wait, what? LED. I'd be like, I think we need to work on the God piece a little bit. So again, prayer, going to synagogue is about for what happens afterward. So that, and drawing on what comes before. I mean, how many of us are not trying to draw on the experiences we've had in life that are meaningful and special? And there are probably a couple of experiences that are like epiphanies that give you your insights into the way you want to live. Many of us have them when we're in our 20s, maybe earlier. And those experiences sort of stick with us and give us the direction for the things that are going to be important for the rest of our lives. It could be nature, it could be helping people, it could be art, it depends. It could be love. So the first part of the service, all prayers of nature, and you'll see that they progress through, they start with, most of them are derived from Psalms, which are nature shepherd poetry. They start with basically saying that you have to hear, you don't have to, you are invited to hear the world as God hears the world. God hears the world as music. God hears every sound that is happening as music. And if only you could hear that too. You should try to hear the sounds of the breathing, the sounds of the wind, the sounds of birds. Rebbe Nachman, very famous writer about prayer, said, if you're really deeply praying, you can hear the grasses singing as well. Everything is made of sound. And here I tell a personal story, which maybe only Chris will appreciate. We'll see. I don't know. Maybe or not. It's only this, which is I used to try to meditate in high school and in college. And I tried and I just couldn't get that. Whenever people said, when you meditate, just don't think about anything. Think nothing. I cannot think nothing. My voice just goes. So I would try and I would try and I would try and I would try and I would try. One day, my sophomore year of college, because I'll never forget it, I was praying. I was sitting on a roof like college kids do, but I tried it before, it hadn't worked. And I got to this point where I heard everything. I was by a field, there was actually a golf course. People talking, sounds on the street, the birds, my breathing. I started to just suddenly hear everything. And it all sounded like music. And Oliver Sacks writes about this in one of Oliver Sacks' books. And I think it may have been my audition weekend here. I gave 2 sermons, and the first one was on Oliver Sacks. Because I said, he wrote what I experienced, and it changed my life. So that I totally get it. God is hearing everything as music. Your brain would be in a different place if you can get to that point. And that also, it divides between inner and outer. What the nature that's inside you is no different than the nature that's outside of you. They're connected. We quote King David when we say, Barchi nafshi et Adonai, kol karavai et shem kadshoho, which is King David says in the Psalms, bless me, my spirit, my innards are praising God too. I take that as not like my soul, but like my spirit, my innards, my guts. I think of all the sounds that are happening in there too. But inside and outside, it's all one music. You say, if only my mouth could be filled with song as the sea is filled with song. and the waves making their sounds, if my mouth could join in with them. And there are all these lines that go on and on. So number one, it's all nature music, and can you join in with it? Then it goes to a second level. When you have the Baruch Hu, you do the Baruch Hu et Adonai, which is the call to prayer. And then immediately it follows, also part of this music is anything that's made of or. God who uvarei choshech uvarei et hakol. God who yotzer et hakol. God who everything that's made of energy is also part of the sound. Then you go beyond energy and you get to the angels. There's also an invisible universe that God is hearing of angels who are singing and part of the prayer or part of the music, and you can't hear them. They're like another dimension that intersects with our own, but it's happening too. You are part of greater dimensions than you even know. And then when you finish that third level, I call it the level of like biology, and then you get to the level of physics, and then you get to the level of theoretical physics. And that goes page by page by page, and then you do the Shema. So when you think about it, you're saying, hear us, hear Jews, hear Israel, the Lord is one. Right after you've basically expanded to see, basically we're all part of one universe, one system. So when I teach the kids in the Hebrew school, which I do, that think of your relationship with God as your relationship to the universe. And the universe is more than just this and this. The universe is bigger than you can imagine. And the teachers look at me, including the college kids, and they're like, I don't think that's God. I think that's just the universe. And I'm like, someday you'll understand what these prayers are about, which is like, it is your relationship to the all. It is you having a conversation with the whole thing. William James nailed it in the Varieties of Religious Experience, says it right at the beginning. He says, your relation to the all is different than your relation to the parts of the all. And the idea that you think the parts add up to an all that is merely the sum of the parts, that's a different kind of relationship. It's not the same thing as saying, I'm going to sort of, that you inevitably have some form of relationship either through denial or through consciousness with the all. Go ahead, Paul.
Just a way of understanding
Yeah.
what you're saying. Just reminds me of the beginning of Genesis.
Yeah, tell me.
Well, I don't know.
You can.
Futurist is a Greek word. I don't think it's Hebrew. But that clearly gives you the big picture, and it's all God's doing. And to be in touch with it is as close as you can get to the miracle of creation.
It is a real struggle because in the beginning, in the Garden of Eden, the idea is like you're just naturally connected and you don't have this other thought. Then Satan gets in your head, right? And remember, what's the first thing that happens after Satan gets us to evolve with the fruit of knowledge? Is you're like, oh my God, I'm naked and someone's going to see me, and now I'm really embarrassed. And that's not being at one with the universe, right? That is being on social media. Social media really is like, oh, I'm going to post my idea about this, and I hope people like it. And then people don't like it, and they made fun of me, and I feel horrible. It's like, it's just all like, I am naked and I am ashamed. I posted that. Can I unpost that? Because I wanted to be like the best one in the thread who posted the cool thing that everyone said, oh my God, they're so right about Israel, or they're so right about Trump, and not be like, no, you're wrong, I'm going to slam you. So the oneness of it. So you do the Shema, that's like the first, so that really concludes that first part of the service. Then you head into the second part of the service, and if the first part of the service is Genesis, it is part of nature, the shepherd ancestors, then you hit a prayer called Mi Chamocha. Mi Chamocha be'elim Adonai, even if you're doing it silently. That's the transition into the Exodus, the book of Exodus. You've left, and the very beginning book of Exodus, which is, then you're enslaved and you need to be freed. You enter the section of the service which is about redemption, prayers of redemption. So then you realize, okay, there's this whole way of connecting to God through nature, but now it's like, you don't get to connect to God through nature when people are enslaving you or oppressing workers or oppressing immigrants and refugees, all the things talked about in the book of Deuteronomy in particular. So Mi Chamocha is the song of crossing the Red Sea, and the waters are parted, so you have a chance for self-determination. And so those prayers are really about what does it mean to be redeemed, which is the reverse side of saying, what does it mean to be put in a situation where you actually have freedom to self-determine, to live according to your values. That's called redemption, and that's where the Amidah is. The Shema is part of nature, and the Amidah is part of redemption. And so the first blessing you do of the Amidah is praise God for our ancestors. It's a gratitude because our ancestors struggled and they bestowed upon us tools to free us. Prayer is a tool to free you. Community is a tool to free you. Values about freedom, democracy, social equity, and equality, they, at great cost, passed on this to us as tools of redemption to free us and free my mind. So the first part of the Amidah is, I have been bestowed on gifts. You go to holiness, which is that holiness is different than morality, and itself, it's all the book of Leviticus. Holiness is a different way of being in the universe and as part of the universe that frees others and frees myself. And then you go through other peace. And then during the week, the things we ask for. If you are not healthy, you are not really free, right? You are limited in your freedom. So we pray for health, and we pray for other people's health. Each section is really about bringing people from oppression, psychologically, physically, politically, in this area of redemption. Go ahead.
Yeah, just what you said about nature before reminds me of something like in physics and I guess probably in chemistry too. There's this thing called emergence. So it's like you have like a bunch of macro level phenomena and it looks random, but then you like have something that emerges from it, like that you can consider to be like it's like the whole is more than the sum of its
Yeah.
parts. So then I was thinking like some time ago that I think maybe that what humans wanted to communicate, part of what humans wanted to communicate as the concept of God was kind of like the ultimate form of emergence in the world as like the ultimate and the supreme like order of things.
That's beautiful. Some of it, it's above me, but I understand. No, but I understand some of it. One of the things that really redeems us is covenant. And covenant is, I would connect it, if I do it correctly, to emergence, which is that, to me, I would define covenant as what can most redeem you is finding places of symbiosis. So just like, I don't know, just as the organelles of a cell came together to create a cell, and organs get together. And I'll just say my E. coli, which are different than me in my tummy, has a symbiotic relationship with another part of me. And Lewis Thomas writes beautifully about this stuff. We are composite beings. And if we can understand that about ourselves, we realize that nature gives us opportunities to emerge into composite organisms. So that Adam, the reason Eve is made from half of Adam is because basically the initial image of God is we were a self-contained organism. And now, once split apart, we can only regain that through partnership. So the covenantal partnership is between us and God. If I do God's purposes on earth, God also gives me something, which is ways of freeing me and ways of freeing others. So it's a relationship where you are linked together forever. You both give up something, but you gain something more powerful. But you also die. Like my E. coli, I think die if my body, thank you, if my body dies, eventually. But as Lewis Thomas used to say, we tend to think that they're like guests in our house. There's no reason not to think that, I don't know, this is a guest in their house. As many of you probably do. If you've never done this before, go home and Google it. My brother's a neuroscientist. He's like, just take a picture of your intestine and your brain and turn them upside down. Because your intestines, there is a reason they're shaped that way and that your brain is shaped similarly. It's because of similar development. He's a neuroscientist at Harvard, actually he just left Harvard. And so like, right, is this the guest of this? But if you turn it upside down, you realize this might be the guest of this. So covenant is really this idea of not that the basic form of the universe is Darwinism, where we fight it out to see who wins, But what if the most inviting force of the universe is God inviting us to symbiotic relationships? If I get richer and the poor get poorer, I win? Or is it like, no, if I get richer and the poor get poorer, we both lose? Like it's a whole different way of thinking. And then you start seeing the Torah as a description of how do you get human beings there. Go ahead, Thunder.
So
No.
you said in covenant, both of you are giving something up, right?
Right.
What is God giving up?
God's power. So in Judaism, God's not omnipotent once the universe is created. The only thing that was omnipotent about God is that the Big Bang. So once the Big Bang happened, by God making space for something that wasn't God, by God making something finite within the infinite, we don't really, most of the rabbis, there's some disagree, don't really believe that, they believe that God has to operate according to natural laws. So if you say, let's say there was a miracle, the rabbis say, in a very famous midrash I teach in the school, once the universe came to be in the first instant, the laws of the universe came into being, and even God cannot violate the laws of the universe. So by giving us power, God no longer has all the power. So when people say, well, I don't believe in God because of the Holocaust, I'm like, yeah. Like Elie Wiesel said, in the first draft of Night, which was not published, the French publisher rejected it. The reason people died in the Holocaust is because other people didn't save them. And then the publisher wouldn't publish Night. So he rewrote it, because Elie Wiesel was not stupid, and he wanted to publish. And he rewrote it as, where was God? You know, how do you believe in God when your father's getting put in the oven? And then they're like, oh, we'll publish that. Because the whole idea they originally wrote is like, people are supposed to do other things. And when Moses is at the burning bush, and God says, I hear the people crying out in Egypt. They've been crying and crying and crying out in their agony and their oppression. And Moses is like, yeah. Then God's like, well, okay, well, I have to do something. And people say, what took God so long? The idea for the rabbis is God's like, why isn't anybody doing anything? Right? And that happens in other patterns in the tradition where it's like, humanity, ultimately, the covenant's supposed to be between the human species and God. It just starts with, and we'll get into it later in the course. The third section, which doesn't happen unless you have a Torah service. So sometimes the Amidah ends, you wrap things up, and you're done praying. That's why Jerry and I are like 7-8 minutes, right? We did some nature, we got to the redemption, and we're done. And on Shabbat morning, and on Mondays and Thursdays, and you take out the Torah, and then you have the third act, which is spiritual enlightenment and revelation. That's communal, although it's also considered personal because you study Torah all week, and you study it, and you hear a sermon. You're supposed to think about it. But so you connect to God through nature, connect to God through redemption, social justice, psychological freedom, meditation. So all forms of what it means to be free and become free, to really truly self-determine. Most Americans think, as Isaiah Berlin wrote, in his famous essay, Two Forms of Freedom, most Americans like the idea that you should be free from interference to self-determine, so then you can do whatever you want. You can shop and listen to music and go for walks and whatever. And but that's not the concept of being free. You are freed, as we were in the book of Exodus, so that you actually get to self-determine a life of your own values. The whole purpose is not diversion, hobbies, escapism. The idea is you were freed to fulfill purposes. Like, you can decide what those purposes are. God has decided through revelation what the purposes of the Jewish people are, but you're free to self-determine. Like, that's what we always wanted, to have our own nation. So you should have your own autonomy. But it's not freedom just to be like, yay, I don't have to do my homework. Go ahead.
Is prayer entirely initiated by us?
Is prayer entirely... So I'll quote Heschel on that. Is prayer initiated by us? The answer, I think the best answer, it's not the only answer, is that is no, because it's both. Because we should think of our relationship to God as one of invitation. In every moment, there's some invitation to greater connection, greater purpose, redirection, greater fulfilling of purpose. And so in a way, the invitation is always happening to be more connected. But like a covenant is a lot like a marriage. So it's a lot like a relationship, which is that sometimes one person is tapping the other person on the shoulder, and sometimes the other person is tapping you on the shoulder. So that in that sense, sometimes we tap God on the shoulder, and we're like, we're doing our best down here. We could use some help. Grant us some enlightenment about what to do in Lebanon and what to do about Iran or whatever it is. So it can go both ways, but it's supposed to be like you're always connected. So sometimes you're getting nudged to be like, you know what, stop thinking about that, think about this now. And then sometimes it goes the other way, which we're kind of like, I'm calling out to God. So that I'm calling out to God for a response. So I know it's getting late, but I did cover a lot. And I'm going to take comments and questions. So when I think about it, I also think about, and I don't know if this is true or if I just think it's true, which is that when you say the portion from the Torah in the Shema, after you say Shema Yisrael, God is one, you say, and you should love God with all of your heart, all of your strength, and all of your spirit, soul. I'll just say spirit. I think of that as the three parts of the service, which is I think of like, I feel like, I don't know, I feel like the heart is kind of connected to nature. I feel like the mighty arm, your strength is kind of like the mighty arm that took us out of Egypt. So I feel like that's about redemption. And I feel like the soul, because I do feel like the soul is connected to my mind, is like enlightenment. And you'll see the pattern over and over again in Judaism. For example, like I said, it's in the Torah. If Genesis is nature, Exodus is redemption, then Leviticus and Numbers are wandering in the wilderness. They're like the receiving of Torah, trying to live the Torah, trying to be enlightened, trying to apply the principles to real life. How do we actually do this? And entering the promised land to do it. So you see it there. You see it in the holidays. So what holiday did we just finish last week? Sukkot. So we start the new year, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So the new year begins. The first big holiday is Sukkot, nature. You live outside in nature. The next major festival, because Hanukkah came later, is what? If you skip Hanukkah, so also, Tu B'Shvat's not a holiday, right? You can still work and go to school and stuff like that. So the next holiday, where you have like a Yom Tov, a Chag, the next Chag is actually all the way till Pesach. Because you can go to work on Purim, you can go to work on Hanukkah, and Tu B'Shvat. So the next one is, so if nature is living in nature in your Sukkah, what's Passover about? Yeah, it's redemption, being redeemed from Egypt and slavery, and our mission in the world. That's what the whole Seder is about. And then after that, 50 days later, 49 days later, comes Shavuot, which everyone forgets about, and it's the third of the three major festivals. That will be on a conversion exam. I will ask questions like, where are the two high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? What are the three major festivals, Sukkot, Shavuot? And then you'll always forget one. You'll be like, Sukkot, Pesach, what am I missing? Shavuot, everyone misses that. And then I'll ask you, name some of the historically based holidays, and that would be Hanukkah, Purim, Tisha B'Av. And so you can see it reflected in the calendar itself. So the calendar itself follows, in a way, the Torah. Genesis, Exodus, Revelation in the wilderness, Sukkot, Passover, Shavuot, and in the prayer service itself. In the service, when you pray, once you're a Jew, this is one of the only things you wait to be a Jew for, is to wear a garment that has the corners, has the four corners with fringes, and these are just to remind you of your responsibilities of being a Jew. We call them the mitzvot, the commandments. They are knotted in a way that make certain multiples, and people who are into math, like in sewing, I guess, or whatever, can get into that. I've never bothered to memorize them, but there are different traditions of the knots. The knots form a pattern, but the basic idea is you look down and you think of all freedom. To the degree you are free, you have all kinds of different obligations and responsibilities. And it's to remember that. And that you wait for. Everything else, if you're practicing to be a Jew, except for wearing a talit, And except for coming up and doing an aliyah, meaning doing blessings for the Torah, we wait on those, but otherwise you can do everything. You can wear a head covering, you can be praying, and I got hooked on this. I get asked a lot, which is a good thing to be asked. I'm going to give up about praying myself because it's too hard. I will just wear this like a toga. Okay, so I feel like a Roman senator. One or two to do. If you're starting to read Hebrew, read one line of the Hebrew maybe, and then focus on the English. Spend some time in your private Amidah just trying to clear your mind and saying, before whom do I stand, and what words would I have? What words do I have for that, rather than, for my cat or for the grocer. So it's like you can make up your own prayers, but for the actual liturgy, I would do a combination of English and Hebrew. Another thing you can do is you can get online. I can send it to you. You can find on YouTube or recordings. Another thing to do is to just play a recording of the morning prayers and kind of do your own thing at the same time. Just get a nice someone's voice that you like. So, there's no one way. There's, paint by numbers to get there. It depends on who you are. And what prayer may mean to you, it could be very different than what it means for me. So I can't tell you exactly how to get there. The idea that you're going to pray like Jerry or like me, or like you, that can take decades to get to the point where you can pray that much Hebrew. And you could also say, just because Nadav's praying so fast doesn't mean I even understand prayer. If Eileen turned to me and be like, Nadav, I really like you a lot, I don't think you get prayer. I think my response would be like, I think you're right. I feel like just a beginner. It's, prayer is a very, again, it's like the Zen person.
There are two values that we're pursuing in performing prayers. There's kavanah, which is the direction that you're going, and there's keva, which is the standardization. And people often say,
They're the words and there's the spirit behind it.
right, so is there value in just going through the words if there's no spirit? And the standard Jewish answer is yes. That if it's not resonating with you today, that doesn't get you off the hook from doing it. And that the process of repeating the prayers and becoming conversant in them, being able to, I don't need, and this I'm not boasting, but I'm not the only one in this congregation. I don't need a prayer book on Shabbat morning. I can do pretty much the whole service, and it's not really from memory; it's from habit, and and there's value in that. That if you can develop the habit of reciting the prayers, whether it's just the first paragraph of the Shema or the first page of the Amidah, it gives you the ability then to go into it more deeply, while you're still communing with the other people in the congregation. And so this balance between what some people criticize as just going through the motions and the deep feeling that might animate you when you're really getting it is a balance that you struggle with all the time. I know that Rav Nadav does, I know that I do,
We all do.
and yet it's worth it to me. If I can get through the prayers and nothing resonates, okay, tomorrow maybe it'll resonate. But that doesn't mean I don't do the prayers. That the prayers have value even if it's routine.
For those of the students in the class who are streaming, you probably heard Jerry through the microphone, but if not, I'll just say it's the perpetual issue in Jewish tradition about prayer, which is it about the form or is it about the spirit behind it? And there's no easy answer. But I like what Jerry said very well, which is in the Tractate of the Talmud on blessings and prayers, they basically say there's value in both. There's value in saying I'm going to go to the Arb and think about how I connect to God through nature. And there's value in doing what Heschel did, which is I'm going to go to a march and say I'm praying using my legs instead of using my words. And there's also value in saying I'm just going to try to do this by rote. There's nothing lost. I will say that it's a little oversimplification, but in the Talmud they say, are you required to have intent for any of it? Could you really just go through it mechanically? And the answer is, almost always in Jewish law, the answer will be you satisfy the obligation with a minimal amount. But you're encouraged to go further. We really have a tradition where there's so much to do, the last thing we want to do is make you feel like you're failing all the time. So the answer is only for the Shema. Only for the one line, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. That's the reason we cover our eyes. You don't have to do it for the other parts of the service where it's repeated. You just do it for the main Shema. But then even then the rabbis say, well, what should happen if you do the Shema and you lost concentration? It's kosher anyway. It's kosher anyway. So, but it shows that they're basically saying, explore. I love what Heschel says. I quote it a lot where he says, if you can pray and there was one word anywhere in the liturgy that you inhabited, then that's more than most people ever get to. So if you manage to pray in just that word, light, just that word, love, it could be anything. Yeah, what? Right, the silent direct object. So that's why Heschel